When he left the Prime Minister's office in November 2015, having been PM for almost a decade, Stephen Harper rode off into history's sunset and hasn't been heard from much ever since. That has not stopped historians from beginning to consider his legacy. And with that, we welcome, from the Institute for Research and Public Policy, Jennifer Ditchburn and Graham Fox. They are co-editors of the Harper Factor, Assessing a Prime Minister's Policy Legacy. And we're delighted to welcome you two here to TVO.
Thanks for having us.
Nice to have you here. Not at all. Let's start with this. Jennifer, you first. Do you believe that the election in October 2015, in which the Liberals went from third place to government for the first time ever in Canadian history, was a repudiation of Stephen Harper's policy choices?
Yes, I think in part it was. I think there were a lot of areas that people were disappointed to. I mean, there were a lot of things that happened during the election that played, specifically during the election, that played into the defeat, the barbaric cultural practices, hotline, and so on. But I think when you look at what he did or didn't do in areas such as the environment, the military, his whole approach to doing politics, to communications, to transparency. I think after that period of time, people had finally said, well, we don't like the direction that this was taken in a policy sense.
You've put probably 10, 11, 12 different policy areas under the microscope in your book, so let's just sort of take a cursory look at some of them right here. The approach to federalism, very different from his predecessors. How so?
Well, I think, first off, federalism is important to Mr. Harper's legacy because it was a big factor in him engaging in politics in the first place. It played a big role in the decade that led to him becoming Prime Minister. And I think it played a big role in his first victory. And his commitment to open federalism, I think, was a deliberate attempt to put an end to this Ottawa knows best executive federalism that we'd seen over the last 30 years. And his commitment to making it more collaborative and more open, I think, was supposed to herald kind of a new era in federal-provincial relations. But what we saw on paper never really materialized over the decade as Prime Minister. And there was some disentanglement between what the federal government was responsible for and allowing for more autonomy for our provincial governments. But the collaboration element was never there. The disentanglement was unilateral. And so I think that is a very mixed part of the Prime Minister's legacy, where he might have successfully dismantled the old order, but he never built the structures for the new one. And so he's leaving that a little bit as a blank canvas to his successor.
Yeah, Jennifer, for example, on the health accord, he essentially got all the first ministers together and then put a piece of paper on the table and said, take it or leave it. Now, that's not the way the country used to work in the past, but what does history teach us about the success or not of having done it that way?
Well, I mean, and one thing I'd note about that specifically, I think the biggest takeaway on the health file, which Michael Decter pointed out, is that what they didn't do was try to find innovation. They didn't move ahead on some of the things that they could have with the provinces, and I think this government is trying to. Maybe it won't have as much success, but it didn't do what the system needed it to do, which is to find where they could institute reform instead of just giving them the money, and we all know what happened all these years later.
Let me put this quote from John Ibbitson to you, which is in your book, Graham, then we'll get you to talk about this. After decades of tensions, he argued, the relative peace on the intergovernmental front over the Conservatives' 9 years in office constituted a significant accomplishment of the Harper government that has led to Canada being more united today than at any time since the Second World War. You agree?
I don't, with respect to Mr. Ibbitson, and he and I have had offline conversations about that.
We love John, but you don't think he got this right.
No, I don't think he did, for a couple of reasons. I think the absence of conflict, in my view, is not a high enough bar to name something a signature success. I think if you look at the long-term trends of support for sovereignty, the downward trend began long before Mr. Harper became Prime Minister. Significant that he didn't engage, and I think that was constructive, but I'm not sure I would say that that was the origin of the sovereignty movement's losing its way. And thirdly, I don't think it's one of his signature success because Mr. Harper himself promised more. He promised a new era of collaboration and openness, and therefore, by his own standards of his early commitments, you have to say unfinished business at the very most.
But they all promised that coming in, Jennifer, and they all herald a new dawn of unprecedented cooperation between the two levels of government. And the reality of governing Canada is It's real hard to do.
It's real hard to do, but let's just take, you're talking about healthcare, but let's take the environment. I mean, I don't think you can deny that getting this agreement on the environmental action, I mean, it's asymmetrical, yes, but I think that was a significant thing that the Trudeau government managed to do. And Harper vacated that area. The provinces many of the provinces wanted the federal government to be engaged and involved in some sort of collective action on climate change, and it just didn't happen.
But that gets back to I'm the Prime Minister who's going to make sure that the federal government sticks to its knitting, as the expression goes, right? Environment is provincial jurisdiction. You guys take care of that. That's what he believed in.
Yeah, but it's provincial jurisdiction, but there's a lot of areas of crossover with federal, and it's very much. I mean, a lot of people would argue it's a moral imperative to do something about the environment. It's something that the whole country should do together. But really, there was not much discussion, collective discussion on that at all. So I think I would agree with Graham on perhaps not agreeing with John Ibbitson on that part. The environment, I think, is one area that they could have done something with the provinces.
Brian Mulroney once told me, job one for every Prime Minister who sits behind that desk is to keep this country together. Job one. By that yardstick, how would you, Graham, judge his handling of the separatist forces in Quebec?
I think that's one element of the federalism question that the Prime Minister actually handled quite well. And we saw it particularly in the period of his prime ministership where Pauline Marois was Premier of Quebec and desperately looking to pick fights with Ottawa. And in the interviews that I conducted with officials in the lead up to writing the chapter, it was very clear that it was a deliberate strategy on Mr. Harper's part not to engage that government, not to take the bait, if you will. And so if Ottawa doesn't take the bait, it's hard to foment anger at the federal government. And so I think that was successful. But I think in looking at there are other elements of evidence that had the sovereignty movement gathered some steam that I'm not entirely sure that Ottawa would have known what to do in reaction to that. It didn't seem like there was much of a plan. I think they succeeded in allowing Quebec voters to vote on things other than sovereignty or federalism. But in the end, it benefited first the NDP of Jack Layton and then the Liberals under Justin Trudeau. And so breaking that mold and ending the Bloc's dominance was a significant and I think important contribution for the country. It didn't necessarily end up benefiting the Conservative family as a political party.
No, fair enough. But Jennifer, he did get that resolution through Parliament. Quote, the Québécois form a nation within a united Canada. He got the Bloc to vote for that. He got the Bloc to vote for a resolution that talked about a united Canada. I mean, you got to get some props for that, don't you?
Yeah, they went on to lose seats in Quebec after that whole episode happened. I don't feel, and I mean, Graham can talk more to this point, but I don't feel that had a lasting impact on the unity question, that particular vote. And he lost a key cabinet minister over that as well, by the way, Michael Chong, in that whole episode. I don't think it was necessarily a big win. But
who was, well, we should just remind everybody, who was the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister who resigned on a point of principle because he didn't go for that.
Exactly.
And of course, he's running for the party leadership today.
That's right. And I think if you look at the detail of how that motion came to be, there's no question it's an important statement, but it is the result of parliamentary tactics more than a grand vision for how the country is to operate. It was in response to a Bloc motion that declared nationhood without the word Canada in the motion. And so it was the battle of the dueling motions in the House of Commons. And sure enough, his parliamentary tacticians did beat the Bloc Québécois on that front, caused some significant difficulty within that caucus. But the fact that we never heard about that motion other than mentioning its passing, it doesn't seem to have affected the federal government's approach to Quebec or to Canada-Quebec relations any more than just kind of chalking up that win. So it won the day, but it didn't shape the years after.
Interesting. Let's finish up on this because we're, of course, seeing a big contrast in the way that Justin Trudeau has chosen to deal with the premiers and the provincial governments and territorial governments as compared to Stephen Harper. A lot more engagement, a lot more meetings, a lot more sort of things happening in front of the cameras, not just behind the cameras. Has that yet proved to be, in your judgment, a more effective way of handling this file?
The intergovernmental file, you mean? I think, as we point out with this book, I think it takes time to evaluate that. But if I would just go back to, first of all, I think having the maximum transparency is the way to go, and I think that we're seeing some of that. But if I go back to the environmental files specifically, I think the health file is unfolding.
Sure, it's a work in
but I
progress.
think on that file that there was some success. I mean, with the exception of Saskatchewan, it's pretty amazing that they got the rest of the provinces to sign on, to do something together, to say that they were in favor of a plan to move Canada forward and reduce emissions.
The Trudeau Liberals did this.
The Trudeau Liberals.
So that argues for increased public engagement with the premiers.
Absolutely.
If the proof of the pudding is in the eating.
Yes, absolutely.
How would you put it?
But at the same time, I think Mr. Trudeau is discovering that some of the reasons that led Mr. Harper not to want to engage with premiers as a group were probably not entirely unfounded. And we've seen the current Prime Minister go the route of bilateral one-on-one deals with specific provinces, which did happen under the former Prime Minister. People like to say that Mr. Harper didn't engage the provinces, and when you look at the numbers, there was a whole lot more that was going on at the bilateral transactional level and at the officials level. And so the summitry of First Ministers' meetings was perhaps over, but there was more going on beneath the surface than many people will give Mr. Harper credit for. But I think Mr. Trudeau is still figuring that out, and we'll see whether this new approach leads to something constructive, including accounting for the Council of the Federation, which is a relatively new beast in this area.
This is the
where
province's club.
having the federal Prime Minister arrive and tell premiers, we'll now have working groups, and have the premiers say, actually, we've been doing that for 7 years, creates some difficulty. And I think they're all learning how to deal with that new architecture.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for setting the table here. You have many chapters in this book which feature, of course, analysis of many different program areas, policy areas under the Harper government. The Harper Factor, assessing a Prime Minister's policy legacy. Jennifer Ditchburn and Graham Fox from the IRPP, it's good to have you here at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.